The massive council chamber stretched out like a metal ocean before Jake Morrison as he stood at the human delegation podium. His hands gripped the smooth edges of the speaking platform, while hundreds of alien eyes watched him from the curved seating areas that rose up like stadium bleachers around the central floor. The air tasted metallic and carried the mixed scents of dozens of different species, some sweet like flowers and others sharp like burning chemicals. Jake had been Earth's voice in this place for 3 long years, and every single day had been a battle against disrespect and dismissal. The other species treated humans like useful pets, good for hard work, but too simple to have real opinions about important matters. Today felt different, though, heavier somehow, like storm clouds gathering before lightning strikes. Council Speaker Veltar clicked his way across the polished floor on 6 insect legs, his massive head swiveling to look at Jake with compound eyes that reflected the chamber's bright lights like tiny mirrors. The alien's mouthparts moved in what humans had learned was the equivalent of a smile, but it never looked friendly on his face. Behind Veltar, the other council leaders sat in their special elevated seats, looking down at the human delegation, like judges preparing to pass sentence on criminals. Colonel Lisa Hartman sat in the chair directly behind Jake, her military uniform crisp and her back straight as a steel rod. She had served as his advisor since the beginning of humanity's council membership, and Jake could feel the tension radiating from her like heat from a fire. Next to her sat Dr. Robert Kim, the human science attach, whose job was to translate the complex alien technologies and policies into terms that Earth's government could understand. Both of them had been through these sessions before, and both knew that today's agenda would be particularly insulting. The chamber fell silent as Veltar raised one of his forearms, a gesture that commanded attention from every species present. His voice came through the translation devices as a mechanical buzz that somehow managed to sound condescending even when filtered through machines. The Council has reviewed the resource allocation requirements for the upcoming cycle, Veltar announced, his words echoing off the curved walls. The human delegation will provide 30% of their total agricultural output to support the Zephyrian colonial expansion efforts. This includes grain, protein sources, and processed food supplies sufficient to feed approximately 50 million Zephyrian settlers. Jake felt his jaw clench as the words hit him. 30% of Earth's food production was enough to feed nearly 2 billion humans. The Zephyrians wanted that much food to support their luxury colonies on worlds that were already rich with resources. Meanwhile, human colonies on the frontier often struggled with basic supply shortages because Earth was required to send so much of its production to other species. The alien speaker continued without pause, as if he was reading a shopping list, rather than demands that would affect billions of human lives. Additionally, human military vessels will provide escort services for all Confederation trade convoys passing through Sectors 7 through 12. Human ships will maintain patrol routes in these areas and respond to any threats against Confederation commercial interests. Lisa leaned forward slightly in her chair, and Jake could hear her breathing become more controlled, the way it did when she was fighting to keep her temper under control. The military escort duty meant that human ships would spend months away from protecting their own colonies and trade routes, all to guard alien merchants who would never return the favor if human traders needed help. Veltar's compound eyes fixed on Jake as he delivered the final insult. However, humans are strictly prohibited from establishing any permanent military bases, research stations, or colonial settlements in these sectors. These regions remain under exclusive Confederation jurisdiction, and human presence will be limited to temporary patrol duties only. The words hit Jake like a physical blow. The Council was demanding that humans risk their lives and ships to protect alien interests in valuable star systems. But humans would never be allowed to benefit from those same systems. They would guard the doors, but never be permitted to enter. The house. Jake looked around the chamber at the faces of the alien delegates, searching for any sign of discomfort or disagreement with these demands. The Regellians sat with their blue-scaled faces showing no emotion at all. The Makari delegation whispered among themselves in their musical language, occasionally glancing at the humans with what looked like amusement. The Stellan representatives, tall and thin like walking trees, swayed slightly in their seats as they always did, but their dark eyes showed nothing that Jake could interpret as sympathy. For 3 years, this had been the pattern. The Council would demand resources, military support, and labor from humanity, always with the explanation that this was the price of membership in galactic civilization. But humans never received equivalent support in return. When human colonies were attacked by pirates, the Council expressed regret, but provided no military assistance. When human traders were cheated or robbed by alien merchants, the Council's courts always ruled in favor of the non-human parties. When humans proposed new technologies or solutions to galactic problems, the Council listened politely and then ignored every suggestion. Jake had tried to work within the system, believing that patience and cooperation would eventually earn humanity the respect and partnership they deserved. He had swallowed insults, accepted unfair trade deals, and watched human interests be sacrificed again and again for the supposed greater good of galactic unity. But today, listening to Viltar outline yet another set of demands that would benefit everyone except humans, Jake finally understood the truth. Humanity was never intended to be an equal partner in this council. They were meant to be a client, species, a useful tool that could be directed and controlled by their supposed betters. The other species had no intention of ever treating humans as equals, no matter how much humanity contributed to galactic civilization. Jake straightened his shoulders and looked directly at Viltar, then slowly turned his gaze to sweep across the entire chamber. His voice was steady and clear when he spoke, carrying easily to every corner of the vast room. The human delegation has listened to these demands with the same patience we have shown for 3 years. He said, each word carefully, chosen and delivered. We have provided resources, military support, and labor to this council without complaint, believing that cooperation and good faith would eventually lead to true partnership and mutual respect. The chamber began to buzz with alien conversations. As delegates realized that Jake was not simply accepting the council's demands as humans always had before, Veltar's compound eyes focused more intently on the human speaker, and several of the elevated council leaders leaned forward in there. Seats. Jake continued speaking, his voice growing stronger with each sentence. However, it has become clear that this council has no intention of treating humanity as an equal partner. We are viewed as a useful servant species, good enough to provide resources and military protection, but not worthy of having any real voice in the decisions that affect our future. The buzzing in the chamber grew louder, and Jake could hear what sounded like laughter from some of the alien delegations. The sound only strengthened his resolve to say what needed to be said. Therefore, the human delegation formally withdraws from this council, effective immediately, Jake announced, his words cutting through the alien chatter like a sword through cloth. We will no longer provide agricultural support, military escort, services, or any other resources to council operations. Humanity chooses to determine its own path forward, free from the condescension and exploitation that have defined our membership in this body. The chamber erupted into chaos as Jake stepped back from the podium. Aliens were chattering, clicking, whistling, and making dozens of other sounds that the translation devices could not convert into meaningful words. Some delegates appeared shocked, others seemed amused, and a few looked angry, but none appeared worried about losing humanities. Contributions. Jake turned and nodded to Lisa and Robert, both of whom stood immediately and began gathering their materials. The 3 humans walked across the chamber floor toward the exit, their footsteps echoing in the sudden silence that fell as the alien delegates realized that the humans were actually leaving Dot as they reached the great doors that led out of the council chambers. Jake heard Veltar's voice behind them, speaking to the remaining delegates in a tone that suggested he was already moving on to other business. The human withdrawal creates some logistical challenges that will need to be addressed, the alien speaker was saying. We will need to redistribute their former responsibilities among other member species and adjust our resource allocation. Accordingly, Jake, Lisa, and Robert walked through the doors and into the corridor beyond, leaving behind the only galactic government humanity had ever known. None of them looked back as the great doors closed behind them with a soft hiss, cutting off the sound of alien voices already discussing how to divide up humanity's former duties. They had no way of knowing that their dramatic exit would set in motion a chain of events that would shake the very foundations of galactic civilization. 3 months had passed since Jake Morrison led the human delegation out of the Galactic Council chambers, and the galaxy was already beginning to feel the absence of human involvement in ways that no one had expected. Captain Ryan Brooks stood on the bridge of the human freighter New Hope, watching his navigation display track their course through what had once been one of the busiest and safest trade routes in known space. The bridge was smaller than those found on military vessels, but it served its purpose well for a cargo ship designed to transport goods between human colonies and the few independent trading posts that still welcomed human business. Ryan had been commanding merchant vessels for 15 years, and he knew these space lanes better than most people knew the streets of their own neighborhoods. What troubled him now was how different everything felt compared to just a few months ago. Lieutenant Amy Foster sat at the communications station, her young face showing the concentration that came with monitoring dozens of different radio frequencies simultaneously. She had joined Ryan's crew straight from the Merchant Marine Academy on Mars, eager to see the galaxy and participate in the grand adventure of interstellar commerce. Instead, she was witnessing the slow breakdown of the trade networks that had connected hundreds of worlds for centuries. "Captain, I'm picking up another distress signal," Amy reported, her voice carrying the tension that had become common among all the bridge crew lately. "It's coming from bearing 27 Mark IV, approximately 6 light minutes away." Ryan moved to look over her shoulder at the communication readouts, noting the signal strength and encryption patterns that would tell him which species was calling for help. The display showed the distinctive marker codes of a confederation merchant convoy, the same type of trade fleet that human ships had been escorting and protecting for the past 3 years. "What's their situation?" Ryan asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Amy's fingers danced across her control panel as she decoded the message contents. "They're reporting attack by Raider Coalition ships, sir. 3 pirates' vessels against a convoy of 8 freighters and 1 light escort. They're requesting immediate military assistance from any nearby vessels." Ryan felt the familiar weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders, the same feeling he had experienced dozens of times during his years of service. Before humanity's withdrawal from the Council, this would have been a simple decision. Human patrol ships maintained regular routes through these sectors, specifically to respond to situations like this, and merchant captains like Ryan were expected to relay distress calls and provide whatever support they could. But now everything was different. The New Hope was no longer part of the Council's merchant marine, and Ryan's crew owed no loyalty to alien traders who had never shown them anything but condescension and disrespect. The Confederation convoy calling for help represented the same government that had treated humanity as a servant species for years. "Sir, what are your orders?" asked his first officer, Lieutenant Commander Steve Martinez, who stood near the tactical display showing the positions of all the ships in the area. Steve had served with Ryan for 8 years, and he understood the moral complexity of their situation as well as anyone. Ryan studied the display for several long moments, weighing the options available to him. The New Hope was a cargo vessel, not a warship, but she carried defensive weapons and had a crew trained in basic combat operations. They could potentially provide some assistance to the convoy under attack, though doing so would put his own people at risk for the benefit of aliens who would never return the favor. More importantly, helping the Confederation convoy would send a message that humans were still willing to serve as unpaid protectors for the galactic community, even after being kicked out of that community's governing body. It would suggest that humanity's withdrawal from the Council had been nothing more than an empty gesture, and that humans could still be counted on to sacrifice their own interests for the greater good. Log the distress call in our communication. Records, Ryan finally ordered, his voice steady despite the difficulty of the decision he was making. Note the time, location, and nature of the emergency. Then continue on our planned course to the new frontier colony. Amy's hands hesitated over her controls for just a moment before she began entering the information into the ship's official logs. Logging distress call, sir. No response being transmitted. The bridge fell silent except for the steady hum of the ship's engines and the quiet beeping of various monitoring systems. Ryan knew that every member of his crew was thinking about the Confederation traders who were fighting for their lives just a few light minutes away, probably wondering why no help was coming despite their desperate calls for assistance. Steve moved closer to Ryan and spoke in a voice low enough that the rest of the bridge crew could not hear him clearly. Sir, are you sure about this? Those people are going to die if someone doesn't help them. Ryan met his first officer's eyes and saw the same moral conflict that he was feeling reflected there. Those people represent the government that spent 3 years treating us like servants and then dismissed our concerns when we tried to address the situation through proper channels. We're not their unpaid security force anymore, Steve. The tactical display continued to show the distant battle, with the Raider Coalition ships systematically attacking the slower Confederation freighters, while the single escort vessel tried desperately to protect all 8 cargo ships at once. Ryan watched the display with the detached professionalism of an experienced spacer, but inside he felt the gnawing doubt that came with making hard choices. Meanwhile, on Earth, Director Helen Parker was reviewing economic reports in her office. Overlooking Lake Geneva, and the numbers she was seeing would have seemed impossible just a few months earlier, without the burden of mandatory resource sharing with the Galactic Council. Human colonies were experiencing growth rates that exceeded even the most optimistic projections from before the withdrawal. Helen had served as Earth's Director of Colonial Development for 12 years, and she had spent most of that time finding creative ways to support human expansion while meeting the Council's ever-increasing demands for agricultural products, manufactured goods, and raw materials. It had been like trying to fill a bucket with a hole in the bottom, with human productivity constantly drained away to support alien interests. The Mars colonies are requesting additional supply shipments for their 3rd major city expansion, reported Commander Pete Williams, Helen's Chief of Staff and liaison to the Military Logistics Division. They're projecting population growth of 30% over the next 2 years, and they need everything from construction materials to medical supplies. Helen looked up from her reports with genuine surprise. The Mars colonies had been struggling just to maintain their existing settlements under the old system, with most of their surplus production being shipped off to feed Zephyrian colonial efforts in distant star systems. Now they were growing so rapidly that they needed help managing their success. What about the asteroid mining operations? Helen asked, referring to the belt mining stations that had been one of humanity's most valuable contributions to the galactic economy. Pete consulted his datapad before answering. Production is up 60% across all major facilities. Without the requirement to ship 70% of our rare metal output to Council distribution centers, were actually able to stockpile strategic materials for the first time in decades. The numbers were almost too good to believe. Human colonies that had been barely scraping by were now thriving. Human businesses that had struggled under alien competition were expanding rapidly. And human workers who had been overworked and underpaid were finally seeing the benefits of their own productivity. Helen was too experienced to celebrate without considering the larger picture. She stood and walked to the large window that dominated one wall of her office, looking out at the city that sprawled along the lake shore below. Somewhere out there, alien species were discovering what it meant to lose access to human resources and protection. "Pete, what are we hearing from our intelligence networks about conditions in council space?" she asked. Pete's expression became more serious as he accessed a different set of reports. "It's not good, Director. 3 separate border conflicts have escalated into shooting wars in the past month. The hegemony wars that we helped contain for the past decade are heating up again. And pirate activity has increased by over 400% in sectors that used to be under human patrol." Helen nodded, having expected something like this. Humanity hadn't realized how much of the galaxy's stability depended on their contributions until they stopped making those contributions. Human ships had been the backbone of interstellar security. Human mediators had prevented countless conflicts from escalating, and human resources had kept dozens of marginal colonies from collapsing into chaos. "Are any of the council species trying to reach out to us?" Helen asked. "Officially, no," Pete replied. "But we're getting some interesting unofficial communications. The Regellian Trade Consortium has quietly inquired about hiring human security firms to protect their merchant fleets." 6 months had passed since humanity walked away from the Galactic Council, and the carefully maintained peace that had defined interstellar civilization for 3 centuries was crumbling like a house built on sand. Council Speaker Veltar stood in his private office high above the main council chambers, looking through the massive viewport at the streams of refugee ships that now filled the space around, the orbital station like metal clouds blocking out the stars. The insectoid leaders' compound eyes tracked the movement of hundreds of vessels, carrying displaced populations from war zones that seemed to be spreading across the galaxy like wildfire. Each ship represented thousands of beings whose lives had been shattered by conflicts that the Council could no longer contain or prevent. Most disturbing of all, many of these refugees were fleeing wars between Council member species themselves. Veltar's 4 arms moved restlessly as he reviewed the reports that covered his desk in neat stacks, each one bringing worse news than the last. The hegemony wars, a territorial dispute between the Makari Empire and the Stellan Confederacy that had simmered quietly for decades under human peacekeeping efforts, had exploded into full-scale galactic warfare just 2 months ago. What had started as minor border skirmishes was now consuming entire star systems and threatening to drag other major powers into the conflict. The door to his office slid open with a soft hiss. And Admiral Zex High of the Regellian Navy entered without waiting for permission. The blue-scaled military commander's usually perfect posture showed signs of exhaustion, and his normally immaculate uniform bore the wrinkles that came from spending too many hours in crisis meetings and emergency planning sessions. "Speaker, we have lost another patrol fleet," Zex High reported, his voice carrying the flat tone that military officers used when delivering news that was too terrible to process emotionally. The entire 7th Squadron was destroyed while trying to maintain the buffer zone between Makari and Stellan forces in the Proxima sector. Veltar's mandibles clicked together in a gesture that served as his species' equivalent of grinding teeth in frustration. The 7th Squadron had been one of their most experienced units, with crews that had served together for years, and ships that represented the pinnacle of Regellian naval technology. Losing them was not just a tactical disaster, but a blow to morale that would ripple through the entire Council fleet. "How many ships do we have left for patrol duties?" Veltar asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer would be inadequate. Zex consulted his datapad with the methodical precision that had made him one of the Council's most respected military leaders. After reassigning vessels to escort merchant convoys and defend our own colony worlds, we have approximately 30% of our previous patrol capacity remaining. That is insufficient to maintain security in even the most critical trade routes, let alone prevent the smaller conflicts from escalating into major wars. The numbers were devastating, but Veltar had expected something like this ever since the humans had walked out of the council chambers 6 months ago. What he had not expected was how quickly the galaxy would descend into chaos without human involvement in maintaining interstellar stability. The other council species had always viewed humanity as useful but expendable, never realizing that human naval forces had been doing far more than just following orders. Human patrol fleets had not simply been providing security for trade routes and colony worlds. They had been serving as neutral mediators in countless small disputes, preventing minor disagreements from escalating into shooting wars through a combination of diplomatic skill and the implicit threat of overwhelming military force. Human commanders had understood the complex web of alliances and grudges that connected every species in the galaxy, and they had known exactly when to intervene and when to step back. More importantly, human forces had been trusted by all sides. In most conflicts, because humanity was seen as having no territorial ambitions of their own. When human ships appeared at the site of a dispute, both sides knew that the humans were not there to grab territory or resources for themselves. They were there to maintain peace and stability, even if that sometimes meant making decisions that neither side liked. Now, with human forces withdrawn to their own space, every other species was left to police conflicts involving their neighbors, allies, and traditional enemies. Regellian ships trying to mediate between Makari and Stellan forces were viewed with suspicion by both sides, who assumed that the Regellians were secretly working to benefit their own interests. The same problem existed whenever any council species tried to intervene in conflicts involving others. Meanwhile, on the human colony world of New Frontier, Governor Carl Jackson was dealing with an entirely different kind of crisis. His office overlooked the main settlement that had grown from a small research outpost into a thriving city of nearly 500,000 people in just 2 decades. But today, his attention was focused on the coded transmission that had arrived from Earth Command just hours earlier. The message was brief, but contained information that could change everything about humanity's relationship with the rest of the galaxy. 3 separate council member species had quietly approached human diplomatic channels through intermediaries, requesting private security contracts to protect their shipping lanes and colony worlds from the increasing pirate activity and regional conflicts. They want to hire us to do exactly what we used to do for free, Carl explained to his security chief, Major Susan Clark, as they shared dinner in his private quarters that evening. The irony of the situation was so perfect that it would have been funny if the consequences were not so serious for billions of beings throughout the galaxy. Susan set down her fork and looked at Carl with the direct gaze that had made her one of the most effective military officers in human space. What kind of terms are they offering? Carl consulted his datapad and read from the decoded messages that had been transmitted through carefully maintained back channels to avoid any appearance of official council involvement. The Regellian Trade Consortium is offering exclusive mining rights to 2 asteroid belts, plus payment in rare metals for convoy escort services. The Centauran Republic wants to hire human ships to patrol their border with the hegemony zones, and they're offering territorial concessions in 3 star systems. The Altarian Federation is requesting human mediators for their dispute with the vegan colonies, with payment in advanced technology transfers. The offers were generous to the point of being almost unbelievable. These were the same species that had treated humanity as a servant race for years, dismissing human concerns and taking human contributions for granted. Now they were offering partnerships and concessions that would have been impossible to imagine just a few months earlier. But Susan understood the larger implications better than most people. If we accept any of these contracts, we're choosing sides in conflicts that could determine the future structure of galactic civilization. Once we start working for some species and not others, we become players in the game instead of referees. Carl nodded, appreciating his security chief's strategic thinking. The temptation to accept these lucrative offers was enormous, especially since they would give humanity access to resources and territories that had been denied to them during their council membership. But taking sides in the emerging conflicts could drag humanity into wars that were not their own, destroying the neutrality that had made them effective peacekeepers in the first place, not far from New Frontier, in a research station orbiting a gas giant in the Outer Rim territories. Dr. Matt Harrison was conducting studies that revealed the true scope of the crisis facing galactic civilization. The xenobiologist had spent 15 years studying the complex relationships between different alien species, mapping the cultural, economic, and political connections that held the interstellar community together. What his research was showing now terrified him more than any military threat or economic collapse. The Galactic Council had not simply been a governing body that made decisions and enforced laws. It had been the central nervous system of a vast organism that included hundreds of species, thousands of worlds, and trillions of individual beings. When humanity withdrew from the Council, they had not just removed one member species from a political organization. They had severed critical connections that allowed the entire system to function. The stability we all took for granted was not natural, Harrison explained in his latest report to Earth Command. It was an artificial construct maintained by constant intervention, mediation, and the threat of consequences for bad behavior. Without those mechanisms in place, every species is reverting to older patterns of competition and conflict that defined galactic relations before the Council was established. Harrison's analysis suggested that the galaxy was not just experiencing a temporary period of instability that would resolve itself once new arrangements were made. Instead, the interstellar community was undergoing a fundamental breakdown that could result in centuries of warfare and chaos. The carefully maintained balance of power that had prevented major conflicts was dissolving, and nothing was emerging to replace it. 1 year after humanity's dramatic exit from the Galactic Council, the true cost of their withdrawal had become undeniable to every intelligent species in known space. Admiral Katie Stone stood on the bridge of the human dreadnought Liberties, Edge watching through the main view screen as a massive convoy of refugee ships limped toward the edge of human space like wounded animals, seeking shelter from predators. The convoy stretched across several light minutes of space, consisting of vessels from at least 12 different species, all fleeing the expanding war zones that now consumed nearly a quarter of the galaxy. Some ships were massive passenger liners designed to carry thousands of beings in comfort, while others were converted cargo freighters packed far beyond their safe capacity limits. Many showed signs of damage from attacks by pirates or military forces, with hull breaches sealed by emergency patches and weapon burns scarring their outer surfaces. Katie had served in the human Navy for 23 years, rising through the ranks during the period when human ships had been the backbone of galactic peacekeeping operations. She had commanded everything from patrol frigates to battle cruisers, always believing that her job was to protect the innocent and maintain stability throughout the interstellar community. Now she found herself in the strange position of being neutral in conflicts that were tearing apart the civilization she had once helped preserve. Admiral, the convoy leader is requesting permission to enter the new Terra system. reported Commander Nick Roberts from his position at the tactical station. They're carrying approximately 40,000 refugees from 7 different species, mostly civilians fleeing the combat zones in the former hegemony territories. Katie studied the tactical display that showed the positions and compositions of all the ships in the convoy. The refugees represented species that had once looked down on humanity as primitive and useful only for manual labor. Now these same beings were desperately seeking sanctuary in human space because it was the only place in the galaxy where they could expect to be treated fairly, regardless of their species or political affiliations. The irony was not lost on Katie or any of her crew. For 3 years, humanity had provided military protection and humanitarian aid to these species through the Council framework, receiving nothing but condescension and exploitation in return. Now the same aliens who had dismissed human concerns and treated human personnel like servants were begging for the protection that only human neutrality could provide. Grant them sanctuary, Katie ordered, making the decision that would define humanity's new role in the galaxy. Establish a refugee processing center on New Terra's third moon and coordinate with the colonial government to provide temporary housing and medical care. This scene was being repeated throughout human space as refugee convoys arrived daily at every major human colony and outpost. The species that had once been humanity's supposed superiors in the galactic hierarchy were now dependent on human charity for their very survival. But with that dependence came impossible choices that would test humanity's moral character in ways that no one had anticipated. On Earth, Director Helen Parker now spent her days managing crisis situations rather than the colonial expansion projects that had once been her primary responsibility. Her office had been transformed into a command center with multiple communication screens showing refugee camps, military deployments, and diplomatic negotiations happening simultaneously across dozens of star systems. The refugee crisis was straining human resources despite the economic growth that had followed their withdrawal from council obligations. Providing food, shelter, and medical care for nearly 100 million displaced beings required a level of logistical coordination that challenged even humanity's efficient colonial administration systems. More troubling still, the refugees brought with them the conflicts and prejudices that had driven them from their homeworlds in the first place. We have reports of violence between Makari and Stellan refugees in the camps on New Centauri, reported General Paul Martinez, Helen's new chief of staff, who had been promoted from military logistics to handle the expanding crisis. Apparently, some of the Stellan refugees are former military personnel who blame the Makari civilians for the folly, destruction of their homeworld. Helen rubbed her temples as she tried to process the implications of this latest problem. Human space was becoming a melting pot of alien species who had been fighting each other for months or years before arriving as refugees. The same conflicts that were destroying their homeworlds were now threatening to spread into human territory, potentially dragging humanity into wars that were not their own. But the refugee crisis was only one aspect of humanity's evolving role in galactic affairs. Every day brought new requests from alien governments seeking human assistance in various forms, all offering compensation that would have been unthinkable during humanity's council membership. The Zephyrian hegemony is offering exclusive mining rights to 3 complete star systems in exchange for human military intervention against the Raider Coalition. Martinez continued, reading from his daily briefing materials. The Stellar Commonwealth is offering similar terms plus technology transfers if we'll provide convoy escort services for their merchant fleets. Helen studied the proposals that covered her desk like fallen leaves, each one representing opportunities that could transform humanity from a minor galactic power into one of the dominant forces in known space. The alien governments were offering territorial concessions, resource rights, and technological knowledge that had been denied to humans for decades. All they wanted in return was for humanity to do what they had been doing for free during their council membership. The offers were tempting beyond measure, but Helen understood the trap that lay hidden within them. Accepting any of these proposals would mean choosing sides in conflicts that were reshaping the entire structure of galactic civilization. Once humanity became the military ally of some species and not others, they would lose the neutrality that made them trusted mediators and safe harbors for refugees. More importantly, Dr. Harrison's warnings about the fundamental breakdown of galactic civilization were proving accurate with each passing day. The interstellar community was not just experiencing temporary instability that would resolve itself once new political arrangements were established. Instead, the galaxy was reverting to older patterns of competition and warfare that had characterized the pre-council era. What's the current assessment of the military situation? Helen asked. Martinez consulted his tactical reports with the grim expression that had become common among all military personnel dealing with galactic affairs. The hegemony wars have expanded to involve 8 major species and at least 20 minor powers. The Regellian Navy has lost 60% of its fleet trying to maintain security in the core systems. Pirate activity has increased by over 700% in areas that used to be under regular patrol. And we're seeing the emergence of new conflicts. Every week as species that have been enemies for centuries feel free to settle old scores. Numbers painted a picture of civilization collapsing under the weight of conflicts that had been suppressed but never resolved during the Council's reign. Human peacekeeping forces had not just been maintaining security through military strength. They had been serving as neutral arbiters who could enforce agreements between species that would never trust each other enough to honor those agreements without outside oversight. Now, with human forces withdrawn to their own territory, every species was free to pursue their own interests without regard for the stability of the larger galactic community. The result was a cascade of conflicts that fed on each other, creating new enemies and destroying the trust that had taken centuries to build. Katie Stone was witnessing this breakdown firsthand as her ship continued to monitor the refugee convoy entering human space. The tactical displays showed not just the immediate ships seeking sanctuary, but also the distant flashes of weapons fire from battles being fought across multiple star systems. Each flash represented thousands of lives lost in conflicts that could have been prevented if the old peacekeeping systems had remained in place. But the most troubling aspect of the crisis was becoming clear to military commanders like Katie and political leaders like Helen. The galaxy was not just missing human military protection and humanitarian aid. It was missing the moral leadership that humanity had provided without even realizing it. During their council membership, humans had consistently advocated for peaceful solutions to conflicts, fair treatment of weaker species, and the protection of civilian populations during military operations. Other species had often dismissed these positions as naive idealism, but they had grudgingly accepted human mediation because it usually produced workable compromises that all sides could live with. Without human voices calling for restraint and compromise, the galaxy's conflicts were becoming more brutal and destructive with each passing month. Species that had once been satisfied with limited territorial gains were now pursuing total victory over their enemies. Military forces that had once tried to minimize civilian casualties were now targeting population centers as legitimate military objectives. 18 months after humanity walked out of the Galactic Council chambers, President Alex Turner stood before the emergency session of the United Nations General Assembly in the rebuilt headquarters overlooking New York Harbor. The weight of galactic leadership had fallen on human shoulders in ways that no one could have predicted, and the decisions made in this room over the next few hours would determine whether interstellar civilization would survive or collapse into centuries of warfare. The assembly hall was packed with representatives from every human colony and outpost, their faces showing the exhaustion that came from managing the greatest refugee crisis in galactic history. Nearly 100 million displaced beings from dozens of species now lived in human space, their presence straining resources and testing humanity's commitment to the principles that had once made them trusted mediators throughout the galaxy. Alex had been elected to the presidency just 6 months earlier, chosen specifically because of his experience as a colonial administrator who understood both the practical challenges of managing diverse populations and the moral imperatives that guided human foreign policy. He was a tall man with graying hair and steady eyes that had seen too much suffering in recent months, but his voice remained strong as he addressed the assembled representatives. "We did not leave the Galactic Council to become conquerors or profiteers," Alex declared, his words carrying to every corner of the vast hall and to billions of humans listening across the solar system and beyond. "We left because we believed in principles that the Council had abandoned: equality, cooperation, and mutual respect among all intelligent species. The solution to the galactic crisis had come from an unexpected source that proved human intuition about fairness and justice had been correct all along." Dr. Matt Harrison, working with refugee scholars from multiple species in the research facilities on Luna, had made a discovery that changed everything about how the galaxy understood its own history and potential future. Deep in the archives of the abandoned Council station, Harrison and his team had found the original charter documents that had established the Galactic Council 3 centuries earlier. These documents, written in languages that predated modern translation technology, revealed that the Council's founders had intended something very different from the hierarchical system that had evolved over time. According to the founding documents, Harrison had explained to the emergency cabinet meeting just 2 weeks earlier, the Council was never meant to be a system with dominant species ruling over client races. The original charter describes a true confederation of equals, with rotating leadership and shared responsibilities among all member species. The revelation had stunned human leadership and provided the key to understanding why the galaxy had descended into chaos so quickly after humanity's withdrawal. The modern Council had been a corruption of its founders' vision, transformed over centuries into a system that concentrated power in the hands of a few species while treating others as sources of labor and resources. Now, as Alex continued his address to the General Assembly, he was proposing something that would have seemed impossible just months earlier. General Lisa Hartman, promoted from her advisory role to become humanity's chief military coordinator, had spent weeks developing the plan that could restore galactic peace while ensuring that the mistakes of the past would not be repeated. "We are offering to broker a new galactic confederation based on the original Council charter," Alex announced, his words sending ripples of excitement and apprehension through the assembled delegates. "A system where every species has an equal. Vivant leadership rotates among all members, and where no single group can dominate the others." The negotiations had taken place in the neutral zone around the abandoned Council station, with human ships providing security while representatives from all the major warring factions gathered to discuss the proposal. Lisa had led the human delegation, her military experience and understanding of interstellar politics, making her the ideal person to navigate the complex web of grudges and ambitions that had driven the galaxy into warfare. The meeting had been tense from the beginning, with species that had been killing each other for over a year, forced to sit in the same room and discuss cooperation. The Makari Empire's representatives had arrived in heavily armed warships, clearly expecting treachery from their Stellan enemies. The Stellan Confederacy's delegation had been equally suspicious, their long ships bristling with weapons as they took positions around the station. But Lisa had understood something that the alien leaders had forgotten during their months of warfare. None of them were winning their conflicts, and all of them were bleeding resources and population at unsustainable rates. The galaxy was destroying itself, and everyone knew it, even if they were too proud to admit it publicly. You are all here because your civilizations are dying, Lisa had told the assembled alien leaders with the blunt honesty that had made her effective as a military commander. Your fleets are being destroyed, your colonies are being abandoned, and your people are fleeing to human space because they know we will not turn them away. This war has no winners, only victims. The alien delegates had listened with the careful attention of beings who knew they were facing extinction if the conflicts continued. Species that had ruled the galaxy for centuries were discovering that their power meant nothing if they used it to destroy the civilization that had given them that power in the first place. But the breakthrough had come when Dr. Harrison presented his research about the Council's original charter. The founding documents revealed that the galaxy's early leaders had faced similar crises of warfare and competition, and they had solved those problems by creating a system based on equality, rather than dominance. Your ancestors understood something that you have forgotten, Harrison had explained to the alien representatives. Lasting peace cannot be built on the subjugation of some species by others. It can only be created when everyone has a stake in maintaining the system, and everyone benefits from its success. The negotiations had continued for 3 months, with human mediators working tirelessly to bridge the gaps between species that had been enemies for generations. The final agreement had required compromises from everyone, but it offered something that none of the warring factions could achieve through military victory: a chance to rebuild galactic civilization on a foundation that could last for millennia. New Galactic Confederation would be governed by principles that humanity had advocated during their council membership, but had never been able to implement under the old system. Leadership would rotate among all member species every 5 years, preventing any single group from accumulating too much power. Military forces would be integrated under unified command structures that prevented any species from using their fleets to dominate others. Trade agreements would be negotiated between equals rather than imposed by stronger powers on weaker ones. Most importantly, the new system included enforcement mechanisms that would prevent it from being corrupted over time as the old council had been. Regular reviews of all policies and procedures would ensure that the Confederation continued to serve all its members equally. Any species that felt they were being treated unfairly could appeal to neutral arbitrators who would have the power to enforce their decisions. As Alex concluded his address to the General Assembly, he reflected on the journey that had brought humanity to this unexpected position of leadership. They had walked out of the old council as a protest against unfair treatment, never imagining that their dramatic exit would trigger a galactic crisis that would ultimately give them the opportunity to reshape interstellar civilization. Today, we do not just return to the galactic community, Alex declared to the packed assembly hall. We help create a better one, where no species is considered inferior and everyone has a voice in shaping our shared future. The vote was unanimous, with every human representative supporting the plan to establish the new Galactic Confederation with humanity serving as its first rotating president. The irony was perfect. The species that had been dismissed as primitive servants had become the moral leaders who could hold a fractured galaxy together. Jake Morrison, now serving as humanity's first president of the Confederation, stood before the inaugural assembly in the rebuilt council chambers 6 months later. The hall had been redesigned to reflect the new system's commitment to equality, with no elevated seats or special positions that would suggest some species were more important than others. As Jake looked out at the assembled delegates from hundreds of worlds, he saw something that had never existed in the old council: genuine respect and cooperation between species that had learned to value each other's contributions rather than compete for dominance. The chamber erupted in approval as representatives from every corner of the galaxy celebrated the dawn of a new era in interstellar relations. the price of leaving the old. Council had been 18 months of galactic warfare and suffering that had cost millions of lives and destroyed countless worlds. But the reward was something far greater than the grudging acceptance humanity had once sought from their supposed superiors. It was genuine partnership among the stars.